Chicago shimmered like a city dipped in glass. The lake reflected the skyline in steel silver, while the cold February wind snaked between high rises, slipping under collars and through sidewalk cracks. Inside the glowing halls of the Art Institute, however, the weather was a distant rumor. Here the air was warm, scented with white wine and old money, filled with polite laughter and the clink of glass against glass. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings like frozen waterfalls, casting soft halos over tuxedos and satin gowns. Behind a temporary marble bar on the mezzanine level, Sienna Blake, 29, tied her apron tighter and adjusted the cuffs of her black dress shirt. She looked every bit the efficient bartender. Fast hands, composed face, barely present. But beneath her collar, a silver cello charm caught the light every time she reached for a bottle, its presence the only whisper of her truth. She didn't belong here. Not really. These nights, these parties full of billionaires and curated philanthropy, were just another gig. The paycheck would help her afford a new microphone and cover the rent for her tiny one-bedroom apartment in Logan Square. But her real life was built on wooden strings and bow hair, on quiet mornings spent recording cello covers in her bedroom studio, uploading them to a modest YouTube following who wrote messages like, "I cry every time," or "This healed, something I didn't know was broken." She lived for that resonance, that human connection. Not this. Still, tonight was different. There was an odd tension in the air, as if the museum's famous impressionist paintings had overheard secrets. Or maybe it was just her nerves. She hadn't played in weeks. The exhaustion of balancing teaching, bartending, and her own creative. Hunger had left her raw. "Sienna," Mia whispered behind her, nudging her elbow. "We're playing truth or dare. Come on, before your shift ends." Sienna shot her a dry look. "Aren't we a little old for that?" "Oh, don't act like you're 80, Trey chimed in, balancing a stolen glass of rosé in his hand. "It's the only thing keeping me sane in this museum of dead aristocrats." Sienna hesitated. She had an hour left in her shift and she hated drama. But something in her, it wasn't rebellion exactly, more like surrender, made her nod. Mia grinned and led her around the back of the bar into a low-lit alcove where two other bartenders were already giggling. Danny passed the bottle of rosé to her. "Truth or dare?" Mia asked, bottle raised like a challenge. "Dare," Sienna said, surprising even herself. Mia's grin turned devilish. "Kiss a stranger right now, the most unapproachable man in this entire room." Sienna's brows shot up. "You serious?" "Deadly," Trey nodded. "Preferably someone who looks like he hasn't smiled since 2003. Sienna laughed despite herself. She took a quick sip from the bottle for courage, then peeked around the corner to scan the gala. And there he was, standing by himself near the edge of the grand staircase, hands in the pockets of a custom navy suit, was a man who didn't seem to belong to the room either. He wasn't mingling, wasn't laughing. He watched the crowd with a quiet, piercing gaze, like he was observing a painting, not a party. His jaw was square, his hair swept neatly back, and his posture didn't just speak of confidence, it whispered command. Sienna pointed. "Him," Mia gasped. "Are you nuts? That's Graham Ellison." Sienna blinked. "Who?" "Ellison Global. He's like the reclusive billionaire of the Midwest. He never does interviews. He doesn't show up at these things unless it's for something massive." "Well, he's perfect then," Sienna said, heart already thudding. Before she could talk herself out of it, she stepped into the crowd. Her breath was tight, but her pace was steady. The crowd blurred into color and sound as she approached him. He didn't see her at first. His eyes were fixed on a Monet in the distance, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft. He turned. His eyes, steel gray, almost silver under the lights, met hers, unreadable and sharp. And before logic could stop her, Sienna leaned in, rose on her toes, and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't long. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. A breath held in time. But it wasn't the kiss that startled her. It was the stillness that followed. His lips, though surprised, weren't cold. His body didn't tense. For a single second, it was as if he'd been waiting for someone to reach him. When she stepped back, flushed and embarrassed, he looked at her like he'd been struck. "What was that?" he asked quietly. "Just a dare," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry." She turned before he could say anything more and fled back behind the bar, her heart thudding like a drum. Behind her, laughter erupted. "Did you really do it?" Mia shrieked. Sienna shook her head, her smile tight. "Yeah, and now I'm going to finish my shift like nothing happened." But she couldn't. Not really. Her lips still tingled. Her fingertips felt electric, and her mind kept replaying the look in his eyes. Not confusion, not offense, just something unsettled. Moved. An hour later, her shift ended. She pocketed her tips and exited into the crisp Chicago night. The wind bit at her cheeks, but it grounded her. She wrapped her coat tighter and walked toward the subway station, telling herself the same thing over and over. It didn't matter. He was a stranger, a billionaire. He lived in a world of gala chandeliers and private jets. She lived in one-bedroom apartments and practiced Bach in between shifts. They'd never meet again. But she was wrong. Across the city, in a high-rise penthouse overlooking the lake, Graham Ellison sat alone, nursing a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. His jaw was tense, his mind still trying to decipher the strange gravity of what had just happened. He didn't believe in accidents. He didn't believe in fate. But that kiss had touched something, buried. And the girl's face, her uncertainty, her fear, her honesty, wouldn't leave his mind. He walked into his private office and sat at his desk, searched Sienna Blake, Chicago cello YouTube. It only took a few keystrokes. Her name surfaced alongside a handful of videos. The thumbnails were simple, her playing cello in a modest room, bathed in golden light. He clicked the first one. The moment the bow touched the strings, the world changed. No filters, no autotune. Just sorrow, purity, and power in a minor key. He leaned forward. The music wasn't perfect. It was real. And that made it impossible to ignore. She played like someone who had broken and rebuilt herself 1,000 times. He didn't know what he was feeling. But he knew one thing with unsettling clarity. He needed to hear her play again. Not just online. Not in passing. In person. He sat back, her music still filling the room. For the first time in 5 years, Graham Ellison didn't feel like a fortress. He felt like a man with a door cracked open, and a stranger's melody lingering just on the other side. The quiet after impact is always louder than it should be. It lingers, not in the air, but somewhere deeper. In the chest, in the breath, in the space just behind the eyes. For Graham Ellison, it settled like an echo after a concert no one knew he had attended. That kiss at the Art Institute had lasted only seconds, but it hadn't released him. It had tethered him inexplicably to something raw and unfamiliar. He had watched her YouTube videos every night since, earbuds in, lights off, the cityscape of Chicago flickering beyond the penthouse windows. Sienna Blake, that was her name. On screen, she sat cross-legged on a hardwood floor in front of a second-hand mic, her cello balanced in perfect intimacy against her body. She didn't perform so much as bleed into the strings. One video in particular, The Quiet Side of Pain, was no more than 4 minutes long, but it became something sacred in Graham's otherwise clinical routine. He didn't tell anyone. Not his assistant, not the board, not the press who speculated endlessly about his reclusive habits. This music wasn't meant for the world. It was for the unseen. And Graham, despite everything he had built, was more unseen than most. On a quiet Friday evening, he dismissed his meetings early. His driver offered the usual options, private dining, rooftop lounges, invitation-only events, but Graham waved him off. "Take me to Hyde Park," he said. The driver blinked. Graham didn't answer. He rarely did. At the corner of 53rd and Lake Park, tucked between a bookstore and a wine shop, was a jazz lounge that hadn't changed in 30 years. It was dimly lit, the kind of place with creaky floors and moody saxophone players. Graham had checked the lineup earlier in the day, inconspicuously, on a page that hadn't been updated since 2009, but it listed her name. Sienna Blake cello. Set 8:30 p.m. He arrived just after 8, wearing dark denim and a charcoal coat instead of his usual tailored armor. Still, heads turned when he walked in. His presence was gravitational, but he ignored the glances and took a seat in the shadows, close enough to hear, far enough to remain untouched. At 8:32, she walked onto the small platform stage, cello case in hand, hair pulled back in a low, practical knot. She wore a faded navy tee, black jeans, and no makeup. Graham felt something in his chest shift at the sight of her. Real, unguarded, unaware of the attention she pulled like tides. She tuned her cello slowly, then lifted her head to address the modest crowd. "Thanks for being here tonight," she said, voice soft but sure. "I'm just going to play what feels right." No one clapped. "It wasn't that kind of crowd," she began. It started with an improvisation, jazz chords layered beneath classical structure. Her fingers danced over the fingerboard, drawing sound from silence with aching precision. Graham closed his eyes. He could feel each note vibrate in his ribs, like her music had bypassed his ears and gone straight to something older, something buried. She ended the set with City Skin, a piece she'd written during a particularly hard winter. The melody moved like someone wandering alone through snow, slow, hesitant, occasionally lost. When it was over, there was a beat of silence, then scattered applause. Sienna gave a slight nod and began packing up. Graham waited until she exited the stage and moved toward the bar for water. She didn't notice him until he spoke. "You rearranged the Bach prelude in D minor." She turned, startled. What?" "In the second piece. That wasn't the original phrasing. You bent the intervals." She narrowed her eyes, uncertain. "You were listening closely." "I always do," her body tensed. "Do you follow me? Or is this just a coincidence?" "I prefer to think of it as timing," he said. "Though I'd be lying if I said I didn't look up your set." Sienna's eyes sharpened. "Why?" "Because your music moved me," he said plainly. She blinked. "You don't look like someone who gets moved." He almost smiled. "That's why it matters." They stood there, two strangers linked by a moment neither fully understood. The bartender called out an order and Sienna turned back to grab her glass. "You're Graham Ellison," she said finally. Not as a question. "Yes, you didn't have to come here in person. If this is about the kiss, it's not." That stopped her. His voice was firm, not cold. Intentional. "I've watched you play," he continued. "Listen to your compositions. You don't just perform, you translate." She gave a dry laugh. "Translate what? Regret? Low income?" "Loneliness," he said. "Longing. Hope, even when it hurts." For a beat, the sarcasm faded from her eyes. "Most people just say nice music." "I'm not most people." She sipped her water. "I don't know what to say to that." "You don't have to say anything," he said. "But I want to make you a proposal." Sienna arched a brow. "You're not exactly subtle." He didn't blink. "I run a philanthropic fund. We're building a new initiative focused on music, education, specifically for underserved communities. I want you to help lead it." Sienna blinked. "Me? Why me?" "Because you've been where they are, and because you haven't forgotten." She stared at him for a long time. "You don't even know me." "I've heard your music," he said, "and that's more than most people ever share." She was silent for a moment. "Do you usually offer jobs to women you kiss at galas?" His expression didn't waver. "No, you're the first." Something flickered across her face. Humor maybe, or interest, or fear. "I'll think about it," she said. "Take your time," he replied, slipping a card across the bar. "But not too much." Then he turned and left, coat flaring behind him, the scent of cedar and control lingering in his wake. Sienna stared after him, unsure whether she'd just met a madman or something rarer, someone who saw through the static. The next morning, a package arrived at her apartment. Inside, a handcrafted cello bow made from Pernambuco wood, the kind she'd only seen in catalogs. She couldn't afford. Tucked beside it was a handwritten note. "For music that deserves to be heard." No name, no branding, just the sound of intention written in ink. She placed the bow gently on the kitchen table and sat down, heart caught between wonder and wariness. She didn't know Graham Ellison, didn't understand what he wanted from her, or if his interest came with strings. But something about his eyes, his silence, his presence, it struck a chord she hadn't touched in years. And like any true musician, she knew when a chord demanded to be resolved. She opened her laptop, typed an email. Subject: Re. The initiative body: "I'm not saying yes, but I'm not saying no either. Maybe we should talk." Sienna. She hit send before she could overthink it. Then she picked up her cello and played something she hadn't dared in months, a melody just for herself, one that asked a question she hadn't found the words for yet. And maybe, just maybe, Graham Ellison had already started answering it. The Field Museum shimmered with the elegance of another curated night. Spotlights reflected off glass cases that held the bones of ancient beasts and artifacts from forgotten civilizations. Tuxedos and sequins moved like elegant chess pieces across the marble floors. and the polished sound of a string quartet echoed off domed ceilings. But Sienna Blake, standing near the edge of the room in a black satin gown she had borrowed from her friend Danny, felt like a misplaced note in an otherwise perfect chord. She had promised herself this wouldn't happen, that she wouldn't feel small just because the world around her gleamed. But now, as she smoothed the fabric of a dress she could never afford, she couldn't help but notice the stares. Some recognized her from the Foundation's press release. Others saw only the odd woman standing next to Graham Ellison, who had once been known as a recluse and was now visibly, even tenderly, interested in someone who didn't seem to belong in his orbit. It had been nearly a month since he offered her a leadership role in the Ellison Youth Music Initiative. Since then, they had worked closely, too closely maybe. Their conversations had grown longer, more personal. She learned that Graham liked old vinyl records and hated red wine, that he slept no more than 4 hours a night and sometimes paced the rooftop of his building just to remember the sky. He learned that she used music to keep herself sane, that her father had disappeared when she was 11, that grief for her wasn't just about absence, it was about silence. Tonight was a celebration of the Foundation's early momentum. The gala featured a video presentation of the pilot programs they'd launched across the South Side, a few early testimonials from students, and a musical score composed by Sienna herself, The Quiet Side of Pain, now reimagined with a fuller orchestration. It was surreal. To hear her music played in that vast museum, projected through speakers surrounded by relics of time, while donors with last names that adorned buildings clinked glasses and murmured praise. For once, her work was not background music. It was centerpiece. Graham had spoken on stage just moments before. He spoke eloquently, with quiet conviction, about equity and education and the role music had played in his own healing. He didn't name Sienna, but he looked at her often, as if each sentence was stitched with something only she would understand. And when he stepped off stage and the lights dimmed for the next segment, a reporter with a predatory smile moved toward her. "You're Sienna Blake, correct?" the woman asked. Sienna hesitated. "Yes?" The reporter extended a mic. "Lovely piece tonight. I couldn't help but notice the similarities between The Quiet Side of Pain and Mia Devon's track from 2008, Edge of Echo. Was that intentional? Or took Sienna a second to process. I don't know that piece," she said honestly. The reporter smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Interesting. Also, our sources tell us you once had a relationship with Vincent Weller. Given his history with Mr. Ellison, how would you respond to critics who suggest your appointment to the Foundation was strategic?" The air vanished from the room. "I didn't even know Vincent was in tech when I met him," Sienna said, her voice barely audible. "It was 4 years ago. He said he worked in music production." From across the room, Graham was watching now, his expression hardening. The reporter pressed on. "And you don't see any conflict of interest considering the Ellison-Weller rivalry and your history?" Sienna stepped back. "That's not what this is." The woman nodded coolly and moved away. Around her, the crowd murmured. Sienna's heart thudded violently as she scanned the room for Graham. He wasn't near the stage anymore. She found him near the gallery entrance, his posture taut, a glass of scotch untouched in his hand. She made her way to him, threading through curious onlookers and stifled whispers. "Graham," she said softly, "please let me explain." He didn't speak. "I didn't know who Vincent really was when I met him. He told me he wanted to help me record an album. He promised studio time, connections. I was 24 and naive. He used me to network, then disappeared." Still, Graham said nothing. His gaze was distant, but his jaw clenched like something inside him was unraveling. "I don't even talk to him anymore," she continued, more desperate now. "I didn't know you two had a history." He finally turned to look at her. "Elise said the same thing," he said, voice low. "She told me she didn't know Vincent was my competitor when she shared my software prototype with him. She said she was innocent, that it was just a mistake." "I'm not her," Sienna whispered. "But how can I know that?" His voice was pained, not accusatory, but it cut through her like a blade. "You think I'm lying to you?" she asked, stunned. "I think I've spent too long building walls to tear them down without proof," he replied. Sienna stepped back. "I shared things with you," she said. "Music I've never shown anyone. Memories. I let you see who I really am. And now you look at me like I'm some strategy in someone else's war." She didn't wait for an answer. She walked away, Past the dinosaur bones and ancient maps and open-mouthed donors. Past the melody still playing overhead, that no longer sounded like hers. Outside, the wind slapped her bare arms. She hugged herself as she hailed a cab, her breath fogging in the night air. When she reached her apartment, she sat on the floor with her cello, but she couldn't play. Her fingers wouldn't move. Her throat closed around a sob she didn't want to make. That night, she booked a bus to Asheville, North Carolina, a place she had only visited once during college, but remembered for its stillness. She had reached out weeks ago to a nonprofit offering music therapy programs for underserved youth. They had an opening. She hadn't planned to take it until now. By morning, she had packed her cello, her notebooks, and a single duffel bag. She left no note, only silence. 3 days later, in a classroom with cracked linoleum floors and a window that looked out onto mountains, Sienna placed her cello on a scuffed table and introduced herself to a group of skeptical kids. "My name is Sienna," she said, "and I'm not here to teach you perfect notes. I'm here to help you make noise that matters." That night, alone in her rented room in a quiet corner of Asheville, she opened her lyric notebook. She didn't know what to write, so she wrote a single line. "I gave you my song and you called it borrowed." And for the first time in weeks, she cried. Not for him, for the part of herself that still believed she had to prove she was worth listening to. But even in that grief, something stirred, a quiet melody beneath the silence, unfinished, unshaken, waiting for her to come home to it. Asheville unfolded before Sienna Blake like a forgotten stanza in a song she once tried to finish. The city, nestled in the cradle of the Blue Ridge Mountains, breathed slower than Chicago. Its streets were lined with whispering oaks and independent bookstores, the kind of town where music didn't echo. It settled, grew roots. She found refuge in its quiet. Here, she didn't have to be the woman who had once stood on a gala stage. She could just be someone who still believed in melody. At the Youth Arts Center where she now taught, the walls were cracked but colored with murals. The children weren't easy. They arrived with stories carried in their posture, their silence, their bursts of rage. But Sienna knew how to meet pain with sound. She sat on worn rugs, letting the children draw notes from hand-me-down violins and battered pianos. She told them it was okay to get it wrong. That music didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be theirs. She didn't mention Graham Ellison. Not to the other instructors, not to the director who had welcomed her on short notice. His name was a note she refused to play. But in the stillness of her rented room, where the window faced the river and the nights got cold fast, she thought of him more than she wanted to admit. She thought of the way he listened, of the silence between his words, of how quickly trust could collapse under the weight of history neither of them asked for. She still hadn't touched the cello, not until one night, a week into her stay, when she found herself outside by the water, the full moon skating across the surface of the river like a ghost. She carried her cello in a soft case over one shoulder and sat cross-legged on a patch of flattened grass. No one was around. It was just her in the dark, and for the first time in days she let herself play. The melody that emerged was raw and wandering. It had no title, no structure, just emotion, the throb of betrayal, the ache of longing, the tremble of unresolved faith. She recorded it on her phone without thinking and uploaded it to her YouTube channel that same night under the name Fractured Symphony. She didn't expect it to be heard. She only needed to let it go. But hundreds heard it, then thousands, including the one man she had hoped and feared would never press play. Back in Chicago, in the top floor office of a tower that had begun to feel too tall and too empty, Graham sat hunched over his desk, earbuds in, listening to the piece on repeat. The first time he heard it, he closed his eyes and swore he could feel her heartbeat through the strings. The second time, it felt like an indictment. By the third, it broke him. She hadn't said his name, but she hadn't needed to. He knew. The cello trembled through unresolved phrases, melodies interrupted before they could land. It was a conversation that had been cut short, a goodbye that never had the decency to speak. He tried to write her, an email, a letter, anything. He typed, "I should have believed you," then deleted it. He typed again, "I let fear get the better of me. I listened to a rumor instead of the woman I trusted with my scars." He deleted that too. The cursor blinked like a reproach. Eventually, he closed the laptop, walked out onto the balcony. The winter air was sharp against his skin, but he welcomed it. It reminded him he was still alive. He had to see her. He called for his driver. "Take me to O'Hare," he said. The car pulled out into the night. The roads were slick with the start of snow, and downtown Chicago glowed like a memory. He sat in the back seat watching the world blur past, her music still humming inside his mind. He had barely made it 10 blocks when the sharp sound of tires, shrieking, jolted him upright. "Hold on," his driver shouted. Graham didn't have time to brace. The car swerved, then slammed into the guardrail, the sound of metal against metal ripping the night apart. The last thing he heard was the echo of her cello, and then silence. The next morning, Sienna was pouring tea in the community kitchen when the TV in the corner of the rec room flashed red. Breaking news. Tech philanthropist Graham Ellison hospitalized after car crash. Foul play suspected. The mug slipped from her hand and shattered. She didn't hear the gasp from a nearby volunteer, or the child who asked if she was okay. All she could see was the footage. A twisted black car. Emergency lights flashing, yellow tape curling in the wind. They said he was in critical condition. They said the brakes had been cut. They said the police were investigating leads tied to Vincent Weller, Graham's longtime rival. Sienna couldn't breathe. The room tilted. All the anger she had stored like firewood, the hurt, the humiliation, collapsed into ash. She left her tea steaming and ran upstairs. In her room she collapsed, onto the floor next to her cello. Her hands trembled as she pulled the small wooden cross from her dresser drawer. Her grandmother's, a piece she had kept more for sentiment than belief. But now she clutched it like it might carry her breath back. "Please," she whispered, into the quiet. "Please don't take him, not like this." She didn't know if she still loved him. She only knew she couldn't imagine the world without him in it. She packed a bag in 10 minutes. Her cello, her cross, a coat, her old notebooks. She drove through the night, from Asheville to Nashville. 6 hours of winding mountain roads and flat highways, her hands gripping the wheel, her eyes raw. She didn't listen to the radio. She listened only to her own heart, beating out a rhythm that felt like prayer. When she arrived at Vanderbilt Medical Center just after dawn, her legs were numb from sitting too long. The ICU ward was sterile and still. The nurse at the desk told her only family could go in. "I'm not family," Sienna said, "but I need to see him." The nurse hesitated, then softened. "You can sit outside his room, just quietly." She sat for hours, watching through the glass. Graham was pale, still. A white bandage circled his head. His chest rose and fell in measured rhythms, kept alive by machines that beeped and pulsed. He looked nothing like the man who once stood at the edge of a gala and watched her like she was the only real thing in the room. She opened her cello case. She didn't ask permission. She began to play. It was barely audible, a whisper of sound, just beneath breath. But every note carried weight. She played Streetlight Lullaby, the song she had never recorded, the one she had written the night after they first met, never daring to believe it could mean anything. She played it now not for recognition, not for proof. She played it for him, as a reminder, as a call. She didn't know if he could hear her, but her music had always found the places words could not go, and now it was all she had left to offer. When she finished, she pressed her fingers to the glass. "Come back," she whispered. "Come back so I can tell you the rest of the song." Inside the room, his hand twitched. The nurse who passed by didn't notice, but Sienna saw it. Then, just barely, she saw a tear slip from the corner of Graham's closed eye. She dropped her head, her shoulders shaking. She didn't believe in miracles, but she believed in music. And in that moment, she believed in something else too. That maybe, just maybe, he was finding his way back to her. Note by broken note. Breath by breath. Silence by silence. The world inside the ICU was a world apart. White light spilled from overhead panels, antiseptic and endless, painting the room in hues of grief and hope. The machines hummed in rhythm, like a synthetic orchestra. The steady beep of the monitor, the quiet rush of oxygen, the distant click of shoes on linoleum floors. It was a place suspended outside of time, where moments stretched and folded back into themselves. And in that stillness, Sienna Blake waited. She hadn't moved from the chair outside Graham Ellison's hospital room since they had let her in. The nurse, gentle but firm, had said only family was allowed at his side. But something in Sienna's eyes must have moved her, because she had made an exception just for an hour and then another. The man inside the room looked nothing like the one Sienna remembered. Graham, the figure who had once filled a gala hall with presence, whose voice could command a room with a single phrase, now lay quiet and unmoving beneath white sheets. A bandage crossed his temple. Bruises darkened the edges of his cheekbones. His breath came slow and shallow, a quiet argument between his body and something greater. She sat by the window, her cello case leaning against the wall like a sentinel. The cross her grandmother had once given her hung around her neck now, the string almost invisible, the wood worn smooth from years of neglect. But she had reached for it the night she heard the news, and it had stayed with her since, as if the act of holding it had reconnected her to something ancient, something she had nearly let go of. She wasn't sure what she believed in anymore. Not in fate, not after the way things had fallen apart, not even in herself, not fully. But as she looked through the glass at the man who had once made her feel like every broken part of her mattered, she realized she still believed in this, in second chances, in redemption, in music that could find its way even through silence, and so she played. The nurses didn't stop her. The cello's voice was soft enough, mournful enough to feel like part of the room. She didn't play for performance. She played as prayer. Each note a thread of memory, a stitch of sorrow, a plea carried into air. She played the first piece she had written in Asheville, then Fractured Symphony, then the unfinished Streetlight Lullaby, the song she had only ever sung to herself in the quiet. She played until her fingers ached and her throat went dry. And then suddenly he moved. Not much. Just a twitch of his fingers, a flutter beneath, closed lids. "Graham," she whispered, rising from her chair, her voice barely more than breath. She stepped to the bed, placed her hand gently in his. "Please," she whispered. "If you can hear me, come back." His hand, cold and limp only moments before, curled slightly around hers. The motion was faint, maybe even involuntary, but it was enough. A sob broke from her lips, sharp and involuntary, and she collapsed onto his arm, her forehead pressing into the fabric of his gown. "I'm here," she whispered. "I never stopped being here." The nurse appeared minutes later, startled to see her crying but smiling. "His vitals are improving," she said softly. "We may be turning a corner." Sienna nodded, unable to speak. The hours that followed were slow, heavy with exhaustion, but they were no longer hollow. The machine still beeped, the air still smelled of chemicals and cleaning agents, but something had changed. She stayed at his bedside, reading aloud from the notebook where she kept her lyrics. She told him stories about the kids in Asheville, about the little boy who called the cello a sleepy elephant, about the girl who wrote her first melody and named it "Don't Be Scared." She didn't know if he heard her, but she needed him to know. That night, when they asked her to step out so they could adjust his medications, she walked into the hospital chapel. It was a small room, tucked at the end of a quiet corridor, with plain wooden pews and stained glass windows that painted soft colors on the tile floor. She sat at the back and held the cross in her palm. "I don't know if I'm doing this right," she whispered. "I don't even know what to ask for. I need him to stay. I need one more chance. And if you're listening, if any of this still matters, I'll wait. However long it takes." She didn't ask for love. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for time. The next morning, Graham opened his eyes. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no sudden surge of movement. Just a slow lifting of lids, a flicker of lashes, the return of something behind his gaze. Sienna was there when it happened. She had been reading again, a quiet verse she had jotted in Asheville. "In the quiet I found you." Through the dark the music stayed. When she looked up and saw his eyes, foggy but focused, her hands dropped the notebook to the floor. "Graham?" she whispered. His voice was a dry scrape. "You stayed." She laughed through tears. "I couldn't leave." He blinked slowly. "I remember. Music. You heard it?" He nodded. "You played." I followed the sound. She leaned closer, her hand finding his. "You came back to me." "I didn't want to," he murmured. "But your voice, it felt like home." The days that followed were slow but filled with light. Doctors confirmed he had passed the most dangerous stages. The swelling in his brain was receding. His vitals stabilized. There would be physical therapy, cognitive assessments, a long road ahead. But he was here. He was awake. And every time. Sienna walked into the room. His eyes followed her like she was the center of his world. His sister Lena arrived 3 days after his awakening. She hugged him with quiet fury and gratitude, then turned to Sienna and without a word pulled her into a gentle embrace. "He never lets anyone close," Lena whispered. "You must be something extraordinary." Sienna blushed, unsure how to respond. Graham's assistant, Raymond, brought updates on the investigation. Vincent Weller was officially under scrutiny. Threatening messages had been intercepted. A former employee of Weller's had been paid to tamper with the vehicle. Sienna didn't ask for justice, but she was relieved to know the danger had a name, and that name wasn't hers. On the 5th night, Sienna sat beside Graham as he drifted in and out of sleep. "I wrote a song while you were asleep," she told him. "I think it's for us." His lips curled faintly. "Play it." "Not yet. It's not finished." "Neither are we," he murmured, and then he slept again. Sienna reached for her notebook and scribbled the words he had just said. "Neither are we." Then beneath it a melody, nothing elaborate, just the beginning of something that might one day become whole. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in weeks her heart wasn't fractured. It was quiet, steady, waiting, and beneath that silence a song still lived. The late winter sun washed over the windows of Vanderbilt Medical Center, casting soft amber light across the white sheets of Graham Ellison's hospital bed. Each day, the room began to feel a little less like a sterile sanctuary for the broken and more like a quiet threshold, one between who he had been and who he might still become. Sienna Blake sat near the window, her back straight but her eyes tired. She had barely left the hospital since he woke. Sometimes when he drifted into sleep, she would curl up with her notebook or polish her cello in the corner. But more often she simply watched him. Not out of fear he'd slip away again, though that fear never quite vanished, but because his presence, even half-formed and healing, steadied something fragile in her. The nurses had begun referring to her as his shadow, but they did so with a smile. She brought calm to the room. She brought music when the nights grew long. And though neither of them spoke of the weeks they'd lost to silence and misjudgment, something deeper passed between them in every glance, every small act of care. She adjusted his pillows. He reached for her hand when pain flared. There was a gravity between them that neither dared name, but both leaned toward like sunflowers chasing warmth. One afternoon, after the physical therapist left and the machines were quiet, Graham turned his head to face her fully. His voice was still hoarse from disuse, but his words were firm. "Sienna," he said, "why did you really come back?" She paused. Not because she didn't have the answer, but because saying it aloud felt like stepping off a ledge. "Because I couldn't imagine the world without you in it," she said. His eyes didn't leave hers. "Even after everything?" She nodded slowly. "I was hurt, I was angry, but underneath all of it, I knew the way you looked at me wasn't fake. I knew the music we shared wasn't performance." Graham closed his eyes for a long moment. "I let fear win," he whispered. "I know," she replied, "but you also let me stay." He opened his eyes again. "I'm afraid that when this is over, when the hospital walls aren't holding us in this cocoon, you'll realize I'm not who you need." She moved closer, taking his hand. "Let me decide who I need." Graham didn't answer. Instead, he traced her fingers with his thumb, as if memorizing the lines of her hand like sheet music. The next day, he was discharged. The hospital staff gathered to say goodbye. Lena offered her brother a ride to his Chicago penthouse, but Graham surprised them all. "I'm going with Sienna," he said. Lena raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Graham glanced at Sienna, who was helping the nurse fold his blanket. "More than I've been about anything in a long time." They returned not to Chicago, but to Asheville. The drive was long. 16 hours stretched across hills and flatlands, snow-dusted valleys and coffee-stained gas stations. Sienna drove while Graham rested, the back seat filled with her cello, a small overnight bag, and a cooler of herbal teas she swore by. They didn't fill the silence with idle talk. They didn't need to. Every shared glance, every quiet smile in the mirror was music enough. When they arrived, it was dusk. Her rental house smelled of cinnamon and old wood, and the floorboards creaked like they remembered her. Graham, weakened but upright, took in the modest space, the cello in the corner, the notepads on the kitchen counter, the tiny framed photo of her mother near the sink. "It's small," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "It's warm," he replied. "It feels real." He slept on the daybed in the corner of her room while she took the mattress by the window. The first few nights he needed her help often, sitting up, walking, even eating. But with every day, strength returned to his limbs, and with every sunrise, something softer settled between them. One morning, he found her on the porch, playing a lullaby to the dawn. She didn't see him at first. Her eyes were closed, her brow furrowed in concentration. The notes floated, gentle and unassuming like petals on wind. When she finally noticed him, she smiled but didn't stop playing. "That's new," he said. "It's for you," she replied, not looking up. He stepped outside, wrapped in a flannel blanket, and sat beside her. "What's it called?" She paused, lowered her bow, and met his eyes. "Where Trust Begins Again." He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached for her hand and rested it over his heart. The next week, they returned to the youth center. The children erupted in chaos when they saw Sienna and fell into stunned silence when Graham walked in beside her. He wore jeans and a knit sweater, his scar faint now under the healing light. He didn't speak at first. He simply watched. Then a boy, no more than 10, tugged on his sleeve. "You're the man from the news," he said. "The one who almost died." Graham crouched carefully. "That's me." "What was it like?" the boy asked. "Being almost dead?" Graham thought for a moment. "Like listening to music from another room. You can't quite hear the melody, but you know it's beautiful and you want to get closer." The boy blinked. "Did you get closer?" "I think someone opened the door for me," Graham said, glancing at Sienna. Afterward, they played music together for the children. Sienna on cello, Graham on an old upright piano they had rescued from a thrift store. They were awkward at first, finding the rhythm between them again. But then something clicked, a harmony returned, and the room filled with the kind of music that wasn't perfect, but it pulsed with life. Later that night, as they sat on the porch with mugs of steaming tea, Graham turned to her. "I need to tell you something." She braced herself. "I used to believe that trust had to be earned in full, like money in a vault, that people had to prove themselves until there was no risk left. And now?" she asked. "Now I think it's more like a song," he said. "You begin unsure, you listen, you adjust, and if it sounds right, you keep playing." Sienna reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "I want to keep playing." "So do I." The moon rose higher, casting silver across the trees. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them looked away. They didn't speak of the future yet. They didn't need to define what they were. All that mattered was that the silence between them had changed. It was no longer something to fear, it was something sacred. And in that silence, music was being written, one note at a time. There are moments in life when the past doesn't knock. It barges in. No warning, no invitation. Just the echo of something unfinished, demanding to be heard. For Sienna Blake, that moment came 2 weeks after Graham Ellison moved into the small guest room of her Asheville cottage. The air between them had softened, warmed by shared meals, quiet music sessions, and long porch talks under the stars. They had found a rhythm again. Not perfect, not without tension, but real. Sometimes that's all two people can hope for after nearly losing everything. But peace, however earned, never lives in isolation. It arrived in a manila envelope. Graham had gone into town for a follow-up with his physical therapist. Sienna was sorting through mail, electric bill, a donation letter from the youth center when she saw it. Thick, unmarked, no return address. Curiosity turned to dread the moment she slit it open. Inside, a printed dossier, photocopies of emails, a hotel receipt from 4 years ago, photos, grainy but unmistakable, of her and Vincent Weller from that time in LA. One of the images showed Vincent's hand on the small of her back, a gesture that felt so distant now it was like watching someone else's life. At the bottom of the stack, a brief note in Vincent's handwriting. "Looks like your new pet still has old tricks. Just thought you deserved the truth this time. V." Sienna stood frozen in her living room, the documents trembling in her hand. She hadn't spoken to Vincent in years. Whatever they'd had was short-lived, a mistake forged out of her desperation and his opportunism. But Graham wouldn't see it that way, not when Vincent had already tried to destroy him once and nearly succeeded. The sound of tires crunching gravel outside jolted her. Graham was home. She shoved the envelope into the kitchen drawer just as he stepped through the door, shoulders slightly hunched from the cold but smiling. He had brought her a scone and a small bouquet of wildflowers from the market, daisies her favorite, but she couldn't smile back. He noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said too quickly, too tightly. He stepped closer, brow furrowed. "Sienna. I'm just tired," she lied. "Long day." She hated lying to him. It sat heavy in her mouth. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. Not when their peace still felt so delicate, like a song only half written. That night, while he slept in the room next to hers, she sat by the kitchen table with the envelope. She reread every word, every photo. Then finally, she picked up her phone and sent one message to Vincent. "You're not going to win this time. You don't own any part of me." She blocked his number before she could see the response. The next day, Graham found the envelope. Not because she showed him, because he had gone looking for sugar and opened the wrong drawer. Sienna was in the garden when he came out, the pages in his hand. His face was unreadable. "You didn't tell me." Her heart pounded. "I was going to." "When?" he asked, voice calm but razor sharp. "After he sent another bomb? After I started wondering again if everything between us was built on a lie?" "No," she said quickly. "That's not what this is. He's trying to twist something that's already dead." "You should have told me," he said again, and this time it cracked something. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I was afraid you'd think I was still connected to him, that it would undo everything we've built here." "You're still protecting me from your past," he said. "But that's not love, Sienna, that's control." His words weren't cruel, but they landed like glass breaking. She swallowed, tears stinging. "I didn't want to break this." "You didn't," he said quietly. "But you bent it." Walked away without slamming the door. That hurt more. That evening she didn't cook, didn't play her cello. She just sat on the porch in the dark, staring at the shadows between trees. She knew he wasn't wrong. But wasn't love supposed to come with grace? Didn't everyone carry things they didn't know how to share? Later, around midnight, she heard footsteps. He sat beside her, silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "Do you want to hear something I've never told anyone?" She looked at him startled. His voice was low, almost broken. "The night before Elise left me, she told me she wished I would just fail, that I would fall apart so she wouldn't have to carry the weight of my brilliance anymore. She said, loving me was like standing in the shadow of a lighthouse and never seeing the beam." Sienna didn't speak. "I've carried that," he whispered, "that maybe anyone who stays with me eventually drowns. I'm not Elise," she said. "I know, but the fear, it doesn't vanish just because I know it." She reached for his hand. "I should have told you about the envelope," she admitted. "I was trying to protect you, but also I was ashamed. Not because of what I did, but because of who I used to be when I met him. I didn't think you'd believe in that version of me." "I believe in all versions of you," he said, "even the unfinished ones." That night, for the first time, they shared the bed, not out of desire, but out of quiet need. They didn't touch beyond their hands entwined under the covers. But the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was healing. In the days that followed, they made space for truth. Sienna showed him old journal entries she had once buried, reflections, on her father leaving, on the ache of chasing dreams that didn't pay. Graham, in return, showed her the unfinished letter he'd written to her in the hospital before the crash. Words of apology, words of hope, words he had been too afraid to send. One morning, she woke to find a new composition on her music stand. It wasn't hers. Graham had written it. 3 pages of notation, delicate and strong, titled simply, "Room Called Forgiveness." She cried as she played it, not because it was perfect, but because it felt like a bridge. That afternoon, they sat on the back porch, surrounded by late spring air and soft birdsong. "You know," Graham said, "we may never be able to undo what's happened, but I think the real test isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing what we let it mean." Sienna turned toward him, sunlight gilding her hair. Then, "Let's choose something better." He nodded. "Let's choose music." "And truth," she added. "And the space to mess up." She laughed softly. "And the courage to forgive." He leaned over and pressed his forehead to hers. "Then I think we've already started the song we were meant to write." And for the first time in their tangled, broken, beautiful journey, Sienna didn't feel like she had to run. She was exactly where the music had always been leading her. Home. The forest just beyond Sienna Blake's cottage had started to bloom. Again, the last trace of frost giving way to fresh green leaves and wild violets peeking up through soft earth. It had been 6 weeks since Graham Ellison moved into her world, one fragile inch at a time, and though the seasons hadn't fully turned, something inside them had. He still walked with a slight stiffness from the crash. She still struggled, with moments of doubt, old echoes that made her second guess when she should lean in. But more and more those ghosts lost their volume. They were learning, piece by piece, how to stay. One morning, Sienna found him at the old upright piano in the youth center. She stood by the door, watching as he played soft, unfinished chords, scribbling something into the margins of a notepad beside him. He didn't know she was there until she spoke. "Is that the bridge?" Graham looked up, smiling softly. It is now. They had been working quietly on a shared piece, something for the youth recital next month. But more than that, something that reflected their unspoken vow to start again. They didn't call it a love song. It wasn't. Not in the traditional sense. It was a confession stitched together by melody, one that didn't pretend everything had been easy or deserved. It only told the truth, that they had been two broken voices who somehow created harmony. Asheville had embraced them like they belonged. The children, so quick to sense authenticity, had welcomed Graham with surprising ease. Even the most guarded of them had started, asking for Mr. Ellison's story. And when he sat down to teach them the difference between a chord and a crutch, they listened. One afternoon, a girl named Becca, barely 11, but with eyes too old for her face, asked him, "Did you ever want to give up?" Graham didn't blink. "Yes?" "What stopped you?" He paused, then looked across the room, where Sienna was tuning her cello. "That," he said, "she stopped me." That night over dinner, Sienna finally said the words she'd held close for weeks. "I love you." Graham didn't rush to respond. Instead, he reached for her hand, brought it to his lips and whispered, "You saved me, so I could love you back. For real this time." They didn't talk about Chicago anymore. Not much. He still had his company, still fielded calls, made quiet decisions. But for the first time in years, it wasn't the center of his life. When he mentioned selling it or stepping down, she didn't protest. Not because she thought he should give it all up, but because she understood now. Success didn't define him. And he didn't want it to define them. What mattered was what they were building here. Still, peace always demands a test. It came on a rainy Tuesday, uninvited and unkind. Sienna received a call from a music agent in New York. A friend of a friend had heard Fractured Symphony online. They wanted to fly her out to perform. There was talk of representation, an album deal, possibly a mini tour with other indie cellists. When she hung up the phone, her hands were trembling. She walked outside, to where Graham was fixing the porch railing. "There's an offer," she said quietly. "In New York," he put down the drill. "For what?" "Music, performing, real audiences." She couldn't meet his gaze. "That's amazing," he said slowly. "Isn't it?" she swallowed. "I think so, but also terrifying." He stepped closer. "Are you afraid of the city, or of what it means to leave?" "Both," she whispered. Graham was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you want me to come with you?" The question nearly brought her to tears, not because it was romantic, but because it was real, meant. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I think I need to go first, just to see if it's still what I want." He nodded. That night, neither of them slept well. They made love slowly, almost reverently, as if to seal something in place before it changed. And when she left 3 days later, cello in hand and ticket in her coat pocket, he didn't ask her to stay. "I'll be here," he said. "However long it takes." New York was louder than she remembered. The lights harsher. The expectations sharper. She stepped onto that first stage with knees shaking and heart on fire. But when the first note left her strings, everything else disappeared. The city hushed. Her soul sang. Audiences cried. People waited after shows just to tell her what her music had made them remember, or feel, or forgive. She stayed 2 weeks, then 3. Graham never called to ask when she'd return. But every night at midnight, she received a message. "Today was soft. I missed your laugh. I made your tea wrong. Again. I listened to our piece and thought maybe it needs your ending." She replied each time, briefly, lovingly. But the distance crept between them like fog. On her 4th week in New York, her agent offered a 6-month tour. It was the dream. Her name on a poster. A national stage. She called Graham from the rooftop of her hotel. They want me for 6 months, she said. There was a pause. Do you want it? He asked gently. I think. Yes, she whispered. And then finally, he said, then go, shine, I'll be here. She hung up with tears on her lips. The tour was everything it promised and not. She was applauded, celebrated, reviewed in magazines. But every night as the curtains fell and silence returned, she felt the hollow space where his presence used to be. In a hotel in Seattle, she played Streetlight Lullaby for the first time on stage. The audience gave a standing ovation, but she couldn't stop crying backstage. 5.5 months into the tour, she boarded a flight home. No announcement, no press, just a decision made in the quiet of a hotel room, where she finally asked herself the only question that mattered. What does it mean if you have the world, but not the person who showed you how to love it again? When she stepped onto the porch in Asheville, dusk had already painted the trees gold. Graham was sitting there just as he said he'd be. He looked up, didn't speak. She walked toward him, dropped her cello and knelt in front of him. I played for the world, she said, but I couldn't hear the music without you. He cupped her face. You don't have to choose. But I did, she whispered, and I choose you. He kissed her, slow, deep, final and beginning at once, and somewhere far inside the woods a nightbird sang. They had chased dreams, faced ghosts, let go, and still, here they were, choosing each other, again. The meadow behind the youth center had never looked quite like this. The early summer sky had pulled on its softest blue, and sunlight dappled the tall grass in gold. Folding chairs were arranged in a quiet semicircle under strings of white lights. Children's paintings, all laminated to guard against the breeze, swayed gently from a clothesline strung between 2 oak trees. In the center, a small wooden arch had been built by the boys from the after-school woodshop program. Crooked in one corner, but proud. It wasn't a cathedral. It wasn't a grand ballroom. But to Sienna Blake, it felt like the most sacred place in the world. She stood by the window in her small cottage, the same cottage where love had once grown shyly between mismatched bowls and morning tea. The mirror reflected the simplest dress she owned. Ivory linen, sleeveless, hemmed just above her ankle. A sprig of rosemary and wildflowers was tucked behind her ear. No veil, no stagecraft, just truth. Behind her, her cello waited in its case, quiet, but present. It had carried her through heartbreak, discovery, and redemption. But today it wasn't the main voice. Today belonged to the life that came after the music. There was a knock at the door. She turned to find Graham Ellison standing in the frame. Not in a tuxedo, not in polished shoes, just a dark button-up shirt and slacks, sleeves rolled, no tie. He looked a little nervous, but in his eyes was the steadiness she had once feared she'd never see again. I thought I wasn't supposed to see you until the ceremony, she teased gently. He smiled. There's no rule book for this kind of wedding. She walked toward him. He held out his hands, palms up. Before we go out there, I just wanted to say thank you. For what? For staying when you didn't have to. For returning when I had no right to expect it. For choosing me when I was still learning how to be someone worth choosing. She took his hands and rested them against her heart. You don't have to earn love, Graham. You just have to allow it. Outside, the first chords of a piano began to drift through the trees, played by one of the kids from the youth center. It was the opening to their song, Room Called Forgiveness, now rewritten with hope in every measure. They walked down the short garden path side by side. No aisle, no separation, just the two of them choosing. The guests were few. Lena sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The children squirmed in their seats, whispering excitedly. Sienna's mentor from the conservatory had flown in quietly and sat in the back, hands clasped reverently in her lap. A local pastor, grey-bearded and gentle-eyed, greeted them under the arch. He began without fanfare. Love is not the absence of pain, he said. It is the decision to keep showing up after pain has passed through. Today you are not promising perfection. You are promising presence. Sienna and Graham turned toward each other. He went first. There was a time I thought silence was strength, that if I kept the world out, nothing could break me. But the truth is, I was already broken long before I met you. And you didn't fix me. You didn't try. You just saw me and loved me anyway. I promised to keep becoming the man you believed I could be. Not just for you, but with you. For every version of you, I vow to stay. Her voice trembled. I spent years thinking music was all I had, that if I lost my art, I would vanish. But then you came into my life and reminded me that love is also a creation, that choosing someone over and over again is its own form of art. I promise to keep choosing you, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, because I never want to return to silence if I know your voice is out there waiting. They didn't exchange rings. Instead, they exchanged notebooks, old ones, the kind artists keep, worn leather, filled with scribbled lyrics and chord progressions. She gave him her first collection of melodies. He gave her his notebook of sketches from the hospital, where he had begun writing music again for the first time in years. The pastor smiled. Then by the music you have written, the forgiveness you've given, and the love you continue to choose, I pronounce you partners in this life. They didn't kiss immediately. They just looked at each other, truly saw each other, and laughed through their tears, and then he kissed her, soft, steady, full of everything they hadn't known how to say. Later that evening, long after the cake had been eaten and the kids had danced themselves into exhaustion, Sienna and Graham sat alone beneath the trees. Fireflies blinked lazily above them. She leaned into his shoulder, barefoot in the grass, the hem of her dress damp with dew. I think this is my favorite place on earth, she whispered. Why? Because we didn't find it, she said. We created it. With mistakes, with mercy, with music. Graham was quiet a moment, then said, Do you want to build something here? She looked up. Like what? A music school, a retreat, a place for artists like you, like the kids, a place where healing and art meet. She smiled, eyes wide. You're serious, he nodded. Let's build the thing neither of us had growing up. A place where people aren't afraid to be seen, or to start again. She kissed him, slow and sure. Let's do it. A wind moved through the trees. Somewhere far off, a nightbird sang again, like it had the day she returned from tour. But this time, she didn't feel like she was returning. She was rooting, in this town, in this garden, in this man. The silence that had once defined their beginning was gone. Not because it had been banished, but because they had learned how to listen through it. They had found their way, not back but forward, together and beneath. All of it, the music played on. Quiet, true, enduring. Sienna Blake and Graham Ellison's story began in the quiet spaces where music meets pain, where talent masks vulnerability, and where silence is not absence, but fear. Sienna, a cellist with a fractured past, carried wounds from abandonment, artistic rejection, and misplaced love. Graham, a tech mogul shaped by pressure and betrayal, used control and isolation to keep from breaking. Their worlds collided through a spark neither expected. Music. What began as a guarded collaboration evolved into a love story forged through misunderstanding, loss, and redemption. From a near-fatal car accident to confronting the ghosts of ex-lovers and buried insecurities, the two navigated choices that hurt, healed, and ultimately redefined them. Their love wasn't linear. It was earned through confession, forgiveness, and choosing one another not just once but over and over again. In the end, they didn't find perfection. They built something better, a life rooted in truth, trust, and the courage to begin again. Life lesson. This story teaches us that real love isn't about avoiding scars. It's about being willing to see them and stay. Healing begins not when things go right, but when two people decide to face the music together. In our lives, we often believe we must be whole before we can be loved. But like Sienna and Graham, sometimes it's the broken notes that create the most honest harmony. Apply this by giving space to vulnerability, yours and others. Whether in love, friendship, or family, remember, healing is always a duet. Mini quiz. What was the turning point that began Graham's emotional transformation? A. His near-death car accident. B. Sienna's success in New York. Comment A or B below. What about you? Have you ever had to rebuild trust in your life? What helped you most during that time? Share your story in the comments so others can learn from your journey too. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create more inspiring stories that touch the heart.